Belfast's Crumlin Road Court heard today an account of life in the secret world of military intelligence, the like of which hasn't been heard before.
It's the end of January 1992, and Brian Nelson has been awaiting trial for 2 years.
The double agent had been held in custodial isolation before being taken to court today for what was being billed as the Army's own Watergate scandal.
Brian walks through a dank underground tunnel to get from Crumlin Road Jail to the courthouse, and he's finally in the dock, where he's admitted to 20 criminal charges, including 5 for conspiracy to murder. He could face a life sentence. Detective John Stevens is watching, along with his team and reporter John Ware. The unprecedented case is being heard by Lord Justice Basil Kelly. Because Brian's pled guilty, Justice Kelly will hear from just one person, a character witness who wants to get Brian a lighter sentence. The witness is deemed highly sensitive and is hidden by a security screen. He writes his name on a piece of paper for the judge. He'll be known to the court as Colonel J, the man we know as Colonel Gordon Kerr.
I feel a personal, moral responsibility to Brian Nelson because I ordered his re-recruitment in January 1987. Brian Nelson is a victim of the system, to which he was actually very loyal. His loyalty was to the army and to the security forces, not to the UDA.
An actor's reading Gordon's words. This is the only time he'll testify in court about the Force Research Unit, or FRU. His chance to convince the country they saved lives.
Our aim was to gain inside knowledge, and at the same time we did not want Brian Nelson to get involved in the murder gangs associated with the UDA.
Gordon paints a flattering portrait of Brian, the brave spy who lived a double life,
A schizophrenic existence.
in service of the British Army.
There are times when he perhaps got too involved with the paramilitary associates where he forgot temporarily his true role. But they're all very explainable as far as I'm concerned because of the strain and the dangers. He is actually a very courageous man.
Justice Kelly interrupts. He wants to know about the times Brian did get too involved, when he took a personal interest in tracking down targets, monitored their movements, and gave their details to gunmen, or when he supplied a machine gun for a shooting. Why did the FRU fail to keep him on the right side?
Perhaps there were errors of judgment. We have to be realistic and realise that an agent in the midst of that sort of murderous type of organisation is bound to get himself in some degree of criminality.
As much as Gordon tries, he can't sugarcoat Brian's behaviour. Under cross-examination, he admits there were handlers in the FRU who were concerned about Brian, who said to him,
We must watch him. He's getting himself into a situation where he's been drawn into terrorist activities. He's allowing himself to become a little too enthusiastic.
Ultimately, Gordon says, it isn't the FRU or Brian's fault, because they didn't have any laws guiding them. And there's only one thing that matters.
There was a lot of potentially life-saving information that he gave, and lives were saved.
Detective John Stevens can't hold back his anger.
My team were absolutely incandescent with rage.
Justice Kelly has a difficult decision to make. This is a test case, a chance for the UK to decide if spies in the Troubles were allowed to commit crimes, or if they should face justice for their actions. Would the lawless system be brought into line, or would it continue to thrive unchecked? I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies, Episode 6, Licence to Kill. I've found there are 2 questions that underpin the role of agents during the Troubles. The first is something I asked in the last episode. Were agents allowed to commit crimes for the greater good of intelligence gathering? The second is even more thorny. Once spies committed crimes, with their handlers knowing, did they have immunity from prosecution? Do you think agents were essentially given a licence to kill then?
I can't see how you can say other than that.
That's Vince McFadden, the lead detective on the Stevens inquiry.
The simple answer is, if you've got an agent committing crime, and if you allow him to continue to do it, you're giving him a licence to kill. How else can you describe it?
There's no escaping the fact that Brian Nelson participated in killing after killing. How many murders do you think Brian Nelson was involved in?
30.
Okay, so here's a list of the murders where Nelson knew that someone was going to be murdered and told his handlers. And so we have the names Terry McDade, Gerard Slane, there's a Davison, Craig, then there's Pat Finucane, Lachlan McGinn, Michael Power, and a Heatley. And attempted murders he was involved in. Attempted murder of John McGrillen, 88. Patrick Monaghan. Attempted murder of James Peter Morgan. Martin McGuinness. Joseph O'Donnell. Sean Cahill, July 89.
But there was a solicitor that was being targeted, and the solicitor wasn't told.
Paddy McGrory.
Paddy McGrory, yeah.
And there's Alex Maskey encouraged the UDA to actually kill him.
The thing that really, really, really needs to be emphasised, this man didn't save lives. He was directly involved in creating the murders of people.
And how many lives do you think he saved?
I want to do him a disservice, but I can't think of any at the moment.
It's a difficult calculation. How many killings Brian Nelson participated in compared to lives he saved? It's important because it tells us what he achieved as a spy in the UDA and whether it was all worth it. There were times when Brian's intelligence wasn't used to warn people at risk, like Danny Morrison, the head of publicity for Sinn Féin.
Their plan was to take over the Falls Library and to shoot me with a machine gun as I was going through the door.
Brian spent a lot of time planning the attack.
He told his handlers about this, and they never made, as it was a legal and moral duty, to warn Mr. Morrison.
How come you weren't assassinated?
I changed my movements quite regularly. I mean, I wouldn't be going through that door at 9 o'clock every morning.
One of the few times Brian's intelligence did save someone's life was that of Jerry Adams. Reporter John Ware explains.
Nelson had been given the task of targeting Adams, getting his movements. The plan was to get a vehicle alongside Adams's car and stick a bomb on the side of Adams's car, drive off, boom, Adams would be dead. When MI5 got to hear about this, they said, no way. It was the one occasion where the security service had intervened. Nelson was deeply frustrated. You know, had he had his way, it would have gone ahead.
Despite Brian's long rap sheet, there was no guarantee he would be prosecuted. Here's how it works. The police put forward a case to the Public Prosecution Service. The Prosecution Service then decide if a criminal trial is likely to succeed based on the evidence. If it is, and it's deemed to be in the public interest, they launch a prosecution. If not, then they drop the case. Behind closed doors, there was pressure to keep Brian out of court, pressure that came from the top of the British government. I've asked my colleague Mick Brown to read some official documents for me. First, there was the Ministry of Defence. They said Brian's prosecution would
challenge the integrity of the system. It would feed the speculations of those who believe that the security forces are involved in a dirty tricks campaign and are in collusion with loyalist paramilitary groups. We are dealing with terrorists, thugs and hooligans, and our agents must be drawn from such people. Nelson is no exception, but despite this, he has been one of the best, a most productive source.
The MOD said Brian's intelligence saved 217 lives. A later inquiry said this figure was totally inaccurate, and that it was actually more like 3 lives saved. Then there was the Northern Irish Police, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, or RUC.
Due to Nelson's dedication, the security forces were able to foil many intended criminal actions by Protestant paramilitaries.
Also found to be highly misleading. The head of MI5 said prosecuting Brian would
damage the morale of other agents.
and put people in the security services at risk of kidnap. Hearing all this, the Secretary of State for Defence concluded there should be no prosecution. Prime Minister John Major was torn. He didn't want it to look like agents had immunity and were above the law, but a trial could damage intelligence in Northern Ireland. The Troubles would continue to rage for another 6 years. Attorney General Patrick Mayhew weighed it all up and decided justice should prevail. Brian Nelson would be prosecuted.
No case which I have seen as a law officer has caused me more concern. Nelson furthered to the point of fruition the murderous criminality which the army are in the province to forestall.
But there wouldn't be a full trial, because Brian struck a deal. He pled guilty to 20 charges, including 5 counts of conspiracy to murder. In exchange, more serious charges were dropped, including several counts of murder. Back in the courtroom in 1992, Lord Justice Basil Kelly had worked through the evidence.
Nelson went beyond what was required of him and involved himself with the murder gangs. In passing sentence, I remind the accused again that the maximum penalty for conspiracy to murder is imprisonment for life. However, the sentences I am about to impose will show that much of the mitigating material given forcefully before me by Colonel J has been taken into account.
Gordon Kerr's defence had succeeded. The judge had given
considerable weight to the fact that he passed on what was possibly life-saving information in respect of 217 threatened individuals.
Brian stood for the judge's decision. He was sentenced to more than 100 years in prison for 20 criminal charges. But Brian was a lucky man. The sentences would run concurrently. He would serve just 10 years. The notorious secret agent had got off lightly, so lightly that people are still angry about it to this day. Survivors of Brian's targeting and bereaved families say it was an injustice. Lawyer Kevin Winters represents many of them.
He was involved in the planning and execution of hundreds of people on an industrial scale, aided and abetted by the state. And it is a disgrace that none of this has ever seen the light of day in a court. It's tantamount to war crimes, it's tantamount to governmental security force state complicity in conspiracies to murder. It's a terrible stain on the justice system that this was never dealt with properly.
Brian didn't face charges for the murders of taxi driver Michael Power, lawyer Pat Finucane, or Lachlan McGinn, even though he had admitted to playing a role. In Pat's case, he gave a photo of Pat to the gunman and drove them past his home. But that case didn't end with Brian's conviction. It spiralled into something far more complicated and revealed even more state complicity. Pat was a fearless lawyer who wasn't afraid of going up against the state. But that attracted unwelcome attention. In the months before he died, his name kept coming up as a potential target, but not from the UDA, from the police. John Ware says,
in December of 1988, there were a number of loyalists in custody, and they recounted how police officers, during their interrogation, said words to this effect: why are you targeting X? You should really spend your time targeting people who matter. For example, Pat Finucane.
In the weeks before Pat was killed, the threats escalated. One of his clients in prison said a police officer had told them, quote, "It would be better if Pat were dead than defending the likes of you." Another was told to find a new solicitor because Finucane won't be around much longer. But there was a far more public threat, one which has puzzled people for years. 4 weeks before Pat's murder, MP Douglas Hogg, the parliamentary undersecretary at the Home Office, had a briefing with the head of the RUC. The police told him some solicitors were effectively in the pockets of terrorists and gave him a profile of Pat. A few days later, Douglas Hogg brought this up in a committee in Parliament. His words have haunted Pat's widow, Geraldine, ever since.
A government minister called Douglas Hogg stood up and said that there were solicitors or lawyers in Belfast who were unduly sympathetic to the IRA.
An MP from Northern Ireland responded to Douglas Hogg in horror. He said the comments had made lawyers targets for assassins' bullets.
Pat was shot dead in front of his family a matter of weeks later.
Geraldine, their 3 children, and Pat's siblings started a tireless campaign.
What is needed in such a high-powered case as this is a full independent judicial inquiry.
I was on the case for 34 years.
For more than 3 decades, the family have worked with Jane Winter.
The consequences of having your husband, father murdered in your dining room, it's terrible.
Jane's the former director of British Irish Rights Watch, which investigated human rights abuses of the Troubles. At the end of the 1990s, as the 10-year anniversary of Pat's death approached, there still hadn't been any convictions for his murder.
There had been a police investigation, there had been an inquest. None of this had got to the bottom of what happened to him. We still, at that point, had no idea who had killed him. And we had our suspicions of state involvement, but we didn't have very much evidence. There were so many questions about Pat's death.
Brian had confessed to targeting Pat with the help of his handlers in the FRU, and he even named people in the UDA involved in the attack, but all of this had remained a state secret.
I don't think anybody realised the scale of deception that took part in Brian Nelson's trial until very, very much later. I think John Stevens was aware of it, but of course he kept everything very close to his chest.
Because he was bound by official secrecy. But then, Jane got hold of Brian's diary and other classified documents I've been looking through.
Which showed that there was a secret unit of the British Army intelligence known as the Force Research Unit.
Jane wrote a report which she delivered to the UK and Irish governments, as well as the United Nations.
And we called it deadly intelligence because that seemed to us to be what it was. That put the cat amongst the pigeons. There hadn't been a lot of fuss about the FRU and Brian Nelson until we started to make a fuss.
And it made the UK government concerned. Were all their secrets about to spill out?
The information about how FRU was operating was now out there. If British Irish Rights Watch knew about it, even though we didn't publish our report, because we said it was so sensitive, then, who else knew about it?
Jane and Pat's family really wanted a public inquiry.
But the government thought otherwise, and they called Stevens in for a 3rd time.
6 years after Brian Nelson had been convicted, Detective John Stevens and Vince McFadden once again packed their bags, left their families behind, and went to Belfast. So began Stevens 3. Just like the first 2 inquiries, it wasn't going to be easy. But Vince had a secret discovery up his sleeve. Back at the start of their first inquiry, he found something critical.
When we were searching a place, we found a microfiche.
A small piece of film, very Cold War era spycraft.
With a lot of names on there. And they were agents. Not sure to this day whether handlers, for military for example, ever knew that we'd got a complete list off his microfiche of agents.
Where had you found that?
I've told you something there that won't come out anywhere else, but I wouldn't enlarge upon it than that.
I appreciate that. So you have a list of names, so you know who's agents, and then also as you're speaking to people, they're starting to confess to you as well.
Yes, they certainly were, because they were looking for an out. We're in trouble here. How can we best get out of this?
Time and time again, Vince arrested people who admitted to being spies.
I suspected everybody of being an agent and worked on that assumption.
The situation in Northern Ireland was far more complicated than Vince ever anticipated, and the intelligence networks far more extensive. Brian was just the tip of the iceberg.
The number of agents that was being run was enormous.
Agents for the army, the police, and MI5.
How many people did you arrest and were actually agents?
How many of the people that we arrested weren't agents? I'm trying to think of one.
John Stevens later disclosed the figures to a government committee.
And when you talk about intelligence, of the 210 people we arrested, only 3 were agents.
207 loyalists out of the 210 they arrested were agents. Lots of people have quoted this figure to me. Kevin Winters says,
"That's a staggering statistic. And that tells you all you need to know about the sheer systemic levels of collusion that existed."
Collusion, the detectives suspected, was at the heart of Pat Finucane's murder. And it didn't just involve the FRU, but also the police's special branch. Neither of these organisations made their inquiry easy.
Nobody would volunteer from the authorities and come and say, well, here is a list of all our agents. So whichever way you looked or went, there were these built-in Chinese walls.
Quite a lot of the stuff that the army had destroyed. And frankly, I think the special branch had destroyed quite a bit of it as well.
And then, of course, you've had quite a lengthy attempt by people to ruin my reputation.
Who are you referring to?
Oh, there's a wide number of them who are very clever at what they do in what I call the dark arts. So without becoming conspiratorial yourself, you know, these inquiries, and they're very, very threatening to people.
John disclosed to me that the commander of land forces had urged John to have me arrested. This was serious affairs of the state, and journalists needed to understand where the dividing line was. You know, it gives you a glimpse into how preposterous a country Britain, for all its merits, can sometimes be.
You'll come across a bit of it doing what you're doing now. Take it from me.
But the detectives kept on digging, and they soon discovered Brian Nelson wasn't the only agent involved in Pat Finucane's murder. William Stobie was a stocky man with a round, shaven head. From Belfast, he did a stint in the army before joining the UDA as an armourer. Behind the scenes, he was a spy for Special Branch. William admitted he'd given Pat's killers guns, one of which was stolen from an army barracks. He said he told his police handlers about the plans for the attack, but just like the FRU, Special Branch didn't intervene or warn Pat. John Stevens arrested William and charged him with murder, but the case collapsed and the UDA executed William Stobie for being a spy. With the detectives back in Northern Ireland, reporter John Ware returned too, and he managed to record a confession from someone in the UDA.
One of the gang who had been involved in the murder, a guy called Ken Barrett.
Ken Barrett said he'd initially been reluctant to kill a lawyer. They were off limits. But he was left with the firm belief that it was the police who were encouraging the attack on Pat. He had been questioned by the police in the original investigation, but he hadn't been charged because he struck a deal. He became an informer for Special Branch, and in doing so, earned himself immunity from prosecution.
After our programme, Stevens put all kinds of listening devices in Ken Barrett's home. And I think they got admission from Barrett talking to his wife that he'd been involved in the murder.
Which was a very difficult undercover operation that went on for about 6 to 9 months.
And he was eventually arrested and charged with the murder of Patrick Finucane, and he was convicted.
Ken Barrett was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2004. He was released 2 years later under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
Barrett is the only member of that gang, to this day I think, who has been convicted of his murder.
Agents appeared to be a protected species, handed a get-out-of-jail card along with a license to kill. And it wasn't just agents who were protected, but the whole shadowy network that supported them. More on that after this short break.
Hello, Venetia Rainey here, one of the executive producers on Bed of Lies. When I'm not working on this brilliant series, I host another Telegraph podcast, Battle Lines. Battle Lines combines on-the-ground dispatches from Telegraph journalists with analysis to help you better understand the complex world of global security, something that's more important than ever before. Follow Battle Lines wherever you're listening to this.
One day when I was reporting in Belfast, I got a breakthrough, and it didn't quite happen in the way I'd expect. I was at the house of former Loyalist fighter Clifford Peoples. As we talked about Brian Nelson, he gave an old associate a call. Who are you calling?
I'm going to call Johnny Adair for you to see if I can get him to have a chat with you.
Johnny Adair, known as Mad Dog, is a former leader of the UDA in Belfast.
Hello, sir. How are you? I have you on speakerphone here because I'm with a friend of mine. Right? Two lovely ladies that you would probably be impressed by. They're doing a podcast about Northern Ireland, terrorism, agents, provos, you name it.
No problem, right up my street.
Yes, all the stuff that you love talking about. So would you talk to them? They want to meet this infamous Mad Dog Adair who was in charge of the killing machine that was C Company.
Right, go ahead. Put them on.
As part of this killing machine in the UDA, Johnny Adair worked with Brian Nelson. And in this brief phone call, he tells me something revealing.
If I would have known what Nelson was and what he was doing, I would have wrapped him in cotton wool. Because what he was doing, without our knowledge, he was supplying bad Republicans, and we working after them. And we weren't getting caught going, or we weren't getting caught coming back. And better still, we weren't even arrested. I've been involved in quite a lot of things linked to Nelson, and I was never once, even to this day, arrested and questioned about any of them. However, I've been arrested multiple times for other things, but anything under Nelson, I didn't even get arrested. So there you go.
That's very interesting.
So that indicates to me that these men weren't worried about getting results and sending people to jail. These men were more and more worried about getting rid of the bad, dangerous IRA men.
It would appear that Brian's connections didn't just protect him, but also those he worked with. This was true in the case of Pat Finucane, and also that of Michael Power, the taxi driver who was killed in the car as he drove his family to church. Brian gave the names of the gunmen who killed Michael to his handlers in the Frew, but no one was arrested. Instead, one of them went on to become a leader of the UDA in Belfast and kill many more people. And Brian wasn't the only spy involved. Another one of the gunmen, George Friars, was killed by the UDA for being a suspected informer. Agents were at the centre of a shadowy network that was built on a culture of impunity. I've been trying to unravel the threads of Michael's murder to get a clearer picture of how high up this went. Brian said local soldiers had pointed Michael out to the UDA as a senior person in the IRA, which he wasn't. But I've learnt another organisation could also have been involved in helping the UDA target Michael: the police. Buried in a government inquiry is one line. The shooting of Michael Power was based on RUC information. If the police encouraged the UDA to target Pat Finucane, could they have done the same with Michael Power? And if so, why? His daughter Michelle has a theory.
In the summer of 1987, my dad was approached by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, that was the police force at the time.
A detective asked Michael
to become an informer. The state wanted my dad to work for them, to gather information on anybody that could possibly be connected to or involved with the Irish Republican Army.
Taxi drivers could eavesdrop on their passengers, so they made good spies. But this wasn't Michael's first run-in with the dark underbelly of Belfast security forces. He happened to be in a prayer group with Joe Fenton, the estate agent who was killed by the IRA for being a police spy. One day, after Michael had been at prayer group, he urged his wife Bernadette that they should pray for Joe. Bernadette believes Joe had confided in Michael that he was an informer, and shortly after, the police tried to recruit Michael, to bring him into their fold. Could they have been trying to buy his silence, to protect their spy Joe Fenton?
My dad said no, he refused.
Michelle believes this put a target on her dad's back.
And the detective became quite angry with my father.
The detective said,
"Well then, I can't protect you. I'll just have to let you be thrown to the wolves." And my dad didn't sleep from it. He paced the floors at night. He was very, very worried.
Michelle's brother Gavin adds,
around the time that my father was asked to become a state agent, to become an informer, that's when the checkpoints started at the top of their street.
Those army checkpoints that disappeared moments before Michael was killed, and after his death.
That detective ended up being in charge of my dad's murder investigation.
The toothless investigation that failed to result in any convictions.
My thoughts don't lie with the gunmen. My thoughts lie with the fact that people in high-profile jobs, people whose very essence is to protect their civilian population, people who are supposed to adhere to and uphold the rule of law, enforce the rule of law, did the very opposite. And so when the state acts with absolute impunity, and when the state is able to murder its civilians and then ensure that a family don't have any kind of justice whatsoever, there's something very, very wrong there.
Unlike in Pat's case, there's been no follow-up investigation into Michael's killing. No one convicted, the truth lingering just out of reach, and his family left asking, would Michael still be alive if it wasn't for the network of spies run by the police and army? Brian Nelson was released from prison before his 10-year sentence was up. He was resettled in Wales with a new identity. He had severe health problems from his unhealthy chain-smoking life. In April 2023, he had a brain hemorrhage and died. He was 55. A week after Brian's death, Detective John Stevens published his findings into Pat Finucane's murder. The Stevens inquiry into collusion in Northern Ireland had been running for 14 years. They'd gathered 1 million pages of documents and 12,000 witness statements. It was the longest criminal investigation in UK history. They arrested more than 250 people and convicted 107 of them. And yet, those looking for answers would be deeply disappointed.
The 20-page public report, which I hope you've had time to look at, is short, but I think you agree it is robust. It cannot go into the detail perhaps that you would like because of the ongoing nature of our investigations and further possible criminal charges and prosecutions.
Thousands of pages of evidence would remain a state secret, and the agent handlers named within would be free to carry on with their lives.
Right, so my name is Mark Kitto, and I, many years ago, in the early 90s, was a serving officer in the British Army in Northern Ireland.
By the late 1990s, Mark Kitto was living on the other side of the world, in Beijing.
Things were happening. It was an exciting place to be. There was a very vibrant and sociable scene in Beijing because you had students, you had diplomats.
And you had people like Mark, who was a businessman.
And then, of course, military.
He was always interested in the military people, having spent a couple of years in Northern Ireland.
Who from the military would you come across?
Well, most likely would be the military attaché.
A military attaché is a high-ranking member of the armed forces who represents the UK diplomatically. In Beijing, they were based at the embassy.
They would do their best to make sure that you were well looked after. So you probably got a really nice flat. You would have, obviously, cars laid on and picnics out at the Ming tombs. And I'm sure there were plenty of flights for diplomats down to Hong Kong to do their shopping or go and see the dentist.
Mark had met one military attaché before, on an earlier stint in Beijing.
A Scot, and he did rather enjoy his gin. I think I had the strongest gin and tonic I've ever had in my life in his flat, and wouldn't stop talking, and was a very gregarious, charming, chatty, half-pissed host.
One evening in the late 90s, Mark was invited to a British embassy party. With a drink in hand, he spotted another military person across the room.
He was shorter than me. I'm 6'1", wiry, primed, certainly fit. You know, that sort of close-cropped hair that I think, greyish.
Mark wanted to reminisce about his army days in Northern Ireland.
What was it like, dashing for the ferry from Larne to get home on leave? Did you work with so-and-so? Did you go to such and such a party at the officers' mess?
So he approached the man.
I asked him his name, and it was Gordon Kerr.
The former head of the FRU had been promoted. He was now Brigadier Gordon Kerr. And he had a cushy new job, military attaché to Beijing.
I sort of froze, took a metaphorical step back, and looked at him and thought, yes, my God. He had a certain reputation, and that was based in Northern Ireland, where I'd been working, so I knew of him and what his specific unit did. He had quite a cold manner about him, a ruthless quality, let's put it that way. I got a sort of uncomfortable feeling. I thought, this is a dangerous man.
There were no strong gin and tonics to be had with Gordon Kerr. Instead, he was tight-lipped and brief.
He expressed a polite interest in what I was doing in Beijing, but he gave the distinct impression that, right, that's enough, I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Gordon had escaped Northern Ireland unscathed. In 1991, a year after Brian was arrested, Gordon received an OBE for meritorious service in Northern Ireland. 5 years later, with Brian in prison, he was awarded a Queen's Commendation for valuable service. 2 weeks after Brian was imprisoned, his handler and Gordon's mentee, Margaret Walshaw, also known as Mags and Captain M, went to Buckingham Palace to receive a British Empire Medal. All this left Detective John Stevens holding his head in his hands. But here's the thing. This all goes higher than Margaret Walshaw and Gordon Kerr. As reporter Neil Mackay says,
you can't tell me that a man like Kerr will be promoted to British military attaché to Beijing at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 21st century, and the British state is unaware. Gordon Kerr is not the ultimate baddie. Gordon Kerr is a high-ranking soldier of the British state.
Gordon and his unit didn't work in a vacuum.
It absolutely would compound the moral harm which is done by this to simply blame this on, gunmen and rogue soldiers.
The FRU were answerable to both the police and MI5, who knew about their work running agents. And the result of that work made it into intelligence reports, which sometimes went as high as the government.
The reports at the Force Research Unit, and I had this straight from a FRU handler, saying, I know the reports I wrote went to the desks of British government ministers.
The government didn't necessarily know about the agents the FRU were running, like Brian Nelson and Freddie Scappaticci, but they did know handlers were operating outside a legal framework. Ray White had told Margaret Thatcher his team in Special Branch were breaking laws every day.
If Kerr was ever arrested, or any of these people ever arrested who wore a uniform and put on trial for what they did, well, you better put some ministers alongside him, because I would be the first person to say that's not fair on Kerr. Why is he carrying the can? Because he's literally a foot soldier. It cannot be seen as something which was simply about a bunch of psychos in Northern Ireland in terror gangs. It cannot be blamed on bad apples in RUC Special Branch or shadowy wings of British military intelligence. It has to move on to mainland Britain, into London, into Whitehall, and into government, because that's where the nerve centre is.
Lawyer Kevin Winters agrees.
I think all of this just went to the very top. I think this notion that it ended just with generals and military overseers is nonsense.
Do you think the Prime Minister knew?
I think this went to Cabinet Office.
Pat Finucane's killing, where do you think that originated?
Well, it's well known about the political comments of Douglas Hogg 3 weeks before he was killed. And I think that gives you an insight into how high this went politically. And that might seem as a very cynical view, but given the world that I inhabit, I'm entitled to that cynical view.
In the 22 years since the Stevens inquiry, there have been 2 more reports into the murder of Pat Finucane. The first was conducted by an independent judge from Canada. Justice Peter Cory investigated 6 high-profile cases from the Troubles that were mired in allegations of collusion, including Pat's.
All of which, in a way, stood for a much larger body of other cases that hadn't been resolved.
Justice Cory was asked to conduct a review that would be behind closed doors, and he couldn't call any witnesses. The family wouldn't get to see any evidence. But they were hopeful, as Jane Winter explains.
Judge Cory himself was a very straight, independent man whom we respected and whom we believed would be honest.
Like John Stevens, Justice Cory faced obstruction from the security forces. His assistant later revealed
that all through their work they were harassed, they were followed around, they believed that their phones were tapped, people were listening to their conversations. They were very much made to feel unwelcome, and the work that they were doing was causing difficulties for the government and that they shouldn't really be doing it.
Then one day, when Justice Cory was away from his office, MI5 came by.
And demanded all their hard drives and took them away, and later returned them completely wiped of all the information on them.
MI5 deny that they wiped the hard drives from Peter Cory's office.
Who do you believe? I would take Peter Cory's word over theirs any day of the week.
Luckily, Justice Cory had taken a leaf out of John's book, and his office was just a duplicate. He had copies of everything back in Canada. MI5 did eventually turn up more material.
He appeared on his doorstep with some more boxes full of documents.
But only after he'd finished his report, and it was too late to make any changes. What did Peter Cory's report say about the Pat Finucane case?
Well, he immediately recommended a public inquiry, and as indeed has every international lawyer who's ever looked at the case. He confirmed beyond doubt that there had been official collusion in Patrick Finucane's murder. But he also said that there were many unanswered questions that only a public inquiry could answer.
Justice Cory's findings made the government squirm.
They didn't like Cory's report at all. They took 5 months to redact the report.
And when it was published, they refused to hold a public inquiry into the murder. 7 years later, in 2011, Prime Minister David Cameron invited Pat's family and Jane to Downing Street.
They'd had real trouble getting to meet anybody, let alone a Prime Minister, up until then. And what happens? David Cameron says, good news.
He was ordering another closed-doors inquiry, just like the Cory report.
They wouldn't see any of the evidence. They wouldn't be allowed to interview any of the witnesses. The family were absolutely devastated.
Pat's brother Martin implored of David Cameron,
why won't you give us a public inquiry? And for a moment, I think the desire to be honest overcame the Prime Minister. And he said, and he made a gesture with his finger of making a circle round the room, he said, because there are people all around here who won't let it happen. I was there to witness that, and It was, I think, an honest answer, and I think he was referring to MI5.
This report was conducted by Sir Desmond de Silva, a former war crimes prosecutor. His findings added to the damning picture.
All the agencies promised that they had told Cory everything, so de Silva should not have been in a position to tell us anything new, but he was.
He found the army had destroyed a gun used to kill Pat, evidence it should have preserved, and the intelligence services had withheld documents from the police.
One of the new things he told us was that the police had been warned on several occasions that an attack was imminent on Patrick Finucane, but Patrick Finucane was never warned about it.
De Silva concluded the state was involved in the murder, when it should have prevented it.
He, too, came to the conclusion there had been collusion in Patrick Finucane's murder, that it could have been prevented.
As a result of the damning report, Prime Minister David Cameron apologised in Parliament.
Sir Desmond's report has now given us, I believe, the fullest possible account of the murder of Patrick Finucane and the truth about state collusion. Sir Desmond says he is, and I quote, left in significant doubt as to whether Patrick Finucane would have been murdered by the Ulster Defence Association in February 1989 had it not been for the different strands of involvement by elements of the state. While he rejects any state conspiracy, he does find, quite frankly, shocking levels of state collusion. This report makes extremely difficult reading. It sets out the extent of collusion in areas such as identifying, targeting and murdering Mr. Finucane, supplying a weapon and facilitating its later disappearance. There were extensive leaks of security force information to the UDA. Failure by the authorities to act on threat intelligence. Employees of the state and state agents played key roles in the murder. Failure to investigate and arrest key members of the West Belfast UDA over a long period of time, and deliberately obstructing subsequent investigations. Mr. Speaker, the collusion demonstrated beyond any doubt by Sir Desmond, which included the involvement of state agencies in murder, is totally unacceptable. We do not defend our security forces by trying to claim otherwise. Collusion should never, ever happen. So on behalf of the government and the whole country, let me say again to the Finucane family, I am deeply sorry.
The first time that the British government had ever actually admitted it. And we thought, well, he's got to give us a public inquiry now. But nothing happened.
Once more, Pat's family were left with more questions than answers. I'm in touch with Pat's family, who chose not to give an interview because of their ongoing campaign. But his widow Geraldine told me something I can't shake. Unless you clean a wound thoroughly, it will never heal. That applies to our case and to society in general in Northern Ireland. There are lots of things that haven't been dealt with properly and therefore will never heal. They'll just fester away until eventually something will happen that isn't very pleasant. What questions are you still asking?
Well, I think the major question is who authorised the murder of a solicitor?
The organisation that hasn't come into De Silva and Cory, and which David Cameron turned his finger around about, MI5.
Absolutely. Stevens never really touched them. Cory spent a couple of days at MI5's headquarters, and he was escorted everywhere, and he even told me with great disgust that he was escorted to the loo. He wasn't allowed to do anything without a minder watching him. So he didn't get very far. MI5 have always been able to stop dead anybody who's trying to find out anything by simply saying national security.
It wasn't just loyalist spies that the British state protected. Far from it. A couple of months after Brian Nelson died, and John Stevens released his report, IRA double agent Freddie Scappaticci was unmasked as steak knife.
Some would say that the Scappaticci steak knife story became a diversion to take away from the enormous state criminality involved in the protection and oversight of the Brian Nelson affair.
The state was about to embark on a whole new cover-up to protect both Steakknife and the establishment who knew all about his crimes. This is something I have totally new information about. It's been 9 months since I first met reporter John Ware, and he's just got back in touch with a new discovery.
What I've found shows just how far the British state went to protect Steakknife, despite knowing he'd been involved in the multiple murder of fellow agents.
Coming up on Bed of Lies.
Shocker for me was that this was written down, sitting on an army file, unredacted, just sitting there.
Nobody realised the ramifications that one little lie being told by Freddie Scappaticci in an affidavit would have.
If he had been prosecuted, a whole lot of stuff would have tumbled out. My understanding is that it was pretty much controlled by MI5.
Why is that necessary if there isn't something that they're trying to hide?
It may not be unlawful, but it sure does look grubby.
Bed of Lies is written by me, Cara McGugan, and produced by Sarah Peters at Tuning Fork Productions. The executive producers are Louisa Wells and Venetia Rainey. Research and fact-checking by Mick Brown, and sound design by Mike Woolley. There's additional production by Georgia Cohen, with thanks to Ryan Gudge and Theodora Laludis. For more of my in-depth reporting, my book, The Poison Line, Life and Death in the Infected Blood Scandal, is out now with Penguin. If you haven't already done so, listen to the award-winning first 2 series of Bed of Lies on this feed, in which I investigate 2 very different scandals.